Hello again everyone, and welcome back to the channel. In today's video we are going to be taking a look at the recently released PILOT Boeing 314, known by many of you I'm sure as the Clipper. The Boeing 314, an absolutely iconic aircraft of the era, it really is the quintessential flying boat. There are actually no flying examples of the Clipper left in existence, so really nice to see the aircraft recreated in the sim. Whilst I'm not a huge flying boat person myself, certainly I do have a significant interest in these historical radial-engined aircraft, and judging by the success of the recently released DHC-4 for the sim, many of you do as well. The product is currently retailing at €30, so not necessarily an expensive aircraft, but by no means a cheap one either. Pilots have previously made a study-level version of the Clipper for P3D, and whilst this aircraft certainly isn't up to those sorts of standards yet, I was hoping that we'd still see a faithful and beautiful recreation of the Boeing 314. Unfortunately, at the moment, to me at least, that doesn't really feel like what we're getting with the product. And of course, as always, I'll aim to try and demonstrate to you why it is that I say that as we make our way through the video. In terms of the video, as usual, I have tried to demonstrate the product here in a fair light, and whilst we aren't going to be carrying out a full flight here per se, I will try nevertheless to give you a reasonably detailed breakdown on the product. In terms of our flight, we are currently moored just off the coast of Gibraltar, and we're going to be taking the Boeing 314 back up towards the UK, landing in at Southampton. During the course of the video, we'll first take a look at the external modelling and texturing of the aircraft, we'll then do the same internally. We'll carry out a startup in the Clipper, we'll depart out towards the south initially before heading west and then back up north over the coast of Portugal. We are going to be flying the departure phase of the flight, however we're not going to be flying the approach into Southampton. Instead, during the cruise, we'll take the opportunity to run through my conclusions on the product, and then we will make a very quick landing into Southampton at the end of the video. It is worth stating, once again, I have tried my best to be fair to the product. I'm sure there will be certain things that we come across along the way caused by user error. I'm certainly no expert when it comes to this sort of aircraft, this sort of flying. With all that being said though, I do still think it's fairly clear, unfortunately, that the product does have its shortfalls. Anyway, we'll aim to cover all of that during the video. As I say, for now, we'll start with a look at the externals of the Boeing 314. So, taking a look at the external model of the aircraft, and overall I have to say I think that the Clipper looks rather nice. Interestingly, I have heard it said by others that actually they prefer the internals of the aircraft. Certainly I prefer the externals in terms of aesthetics, but of course, at the end of the day, that does come down somewhat to a question of taste. Detailing in the modelling is reasonable, although of course there are much more detailed aircraft available within the sim. And the same goes with the texturing. Whilst personally I think it looks pretty good overall, it certainly isn't the most detailed that I've seen. Similarly, if you get really close into the aircraft, some of the markings there are a little bit blurry. In terms of PBR, again not bad necessarily, but the aircraft does look perhaps a little bit dull, a little bit uniform throughout. Under the right lighting conditions though, I do think that the Clipper looks reasonably photorealistic, and again by no means a bad external model. You can see here though that the detailing externally is pretty mid-range. For example here, the detailing on the engine, the prop spinners, the props themselves, nothing to write home about, and similarly what I assume is the air intake there above the engine, again no detailing really there internally. There are a couple of nice features included. Firstly, we have a ground trolley for operations should you wish to board the aircraft onto land. Not necessarily something you'll get a whole lot of use out of probably in the sim, but nevertheless again I think a nice touch. Although there is a little bit of a bug associated with that I believe. If you have the aircraft in the water and you actuate the wheels, you can actually raise the 314 out of the water. And similarly, the Clipper does actually come with a mooring line. A nice visual detail there, and it does actually keep the aircraft stationary as well, albeit you will tend to weather vane into wind. So for me, personally, I don't think the externals of the aircraft are too bad. Certainly at this sort of price point, an acceptable level of detail I would say. Nevertheless though, I was hoping for a more finely detailed version of the Boeing 314, again especially given the aircraft's iconic nature and the fact that it's no longer flying in the real world. Moving internally then, we'll take a look at the cockpit as we carry out the flight. We'll just take a look down the back first, taking a look at some of the details of the various stations. The entire cockpit deck has been modelled, which is nice. You can see here we do have the radio operator station as well as the flight engineer station. The modelling detail is certainly very reasonable, with nice touches, for example there the radio operator's headset as well as the typewriter. The texturing though does very little for me. Personally I'm not a big fan of the internals of the aircraft in terms of texturing. There are one or two nice cockpit textures up the front, but generally speaking the textures look rather dated, And I could be wrong, but from the images I've seen, I haven't seen any photos that would suggest this particular shading of green is accurate for the cockpit, and again, it certainly isn't very aesthetically pleasing. As far as the flight engineer's station goes, we will take more of a look at that in just a moment's time. Again, the modelling accuracy is reasonable, it does look pretty true to life of the photos that I've seen. Texturing is so-so, and at the moment in terms of systems depth, the aircraft is a little bit weak, certainly not what I was expecting or really hoping for. We do also have the navigator station modelled, which I do think has been done quite nicely, although there's no real functionality associated with it. None of the doors on the aircraft seem to function, which is a real shame. It would be a nice feature to have, and it does rather leave you wanting in terms of moving around the aircraft. For example, here you can see the access hatch to the wing route, and it looks really interesting. It looks as though pilots have actually taken the time to model the wing route. But again, the door can't be opened as best I can tell, and the camera won't let you warp through the door, so you're a little bit stuck just looking through the porthole, wondering what might be. And that really goes for the entirety of the Boeing 314, unfortunately. The aircraft has been modelled throughout internally, but it's very difficult to reach any specific area. For example, you can't make use, as we've discussed, of the default cockpit camera. As best I can tell, the only way that you can access the internal compartments of the aircraft is using the external fixed camera. As I've already mentioned, the full cabin of the Clipper has been modelled, which is nice to see. Again, fairly basic in terms of modelling detail, although I believe that choice has been made to save on FPS, which is fair enough. The cabin here viewed from one of the fixed viewpoints that we mentioned just a moment ago. Again, I do think it's a shame that we have this fixed viewpoint system. I know that some of you would rather enjoy sitting down in one of the leather chairs, for example, and watching the world go by. The texturing of the cabin is once more fairly basic, but I don't mind that too much down the back of the aircraft. I was really hoping that we'd get an aircraft where you could just feel the ambience of this historic machine, both in the cockpit and down the back, and frankly that isn't the case here. Anyway, speaking of the cockpit, let's head back up the front. We're going to be running our way here through the abbreviated start procedures as provided by pilots. It's worth mentioning, currently there are no in-sim checklists provided, and I didn't go away and find a real-world example. Firstly, I'm not sure if I'd be able to, and secondly, I don't really think that the aircraft systems currently warrant doing so. So a little bit unorthodox here, but to save us jumping around between stations, we'll first work our way through the flight engineers panel, and then we'll move up to the front left seat of the flight itself. So starting with the engineers panel then, and as you can see it has been reasonably accurately modelled overall. There are certainly some switches which don't work, and certainly the systems do feel somewhat simplified overall. Obviously, hopefully you'll get a feel for that throughout the video. Anyway, running through our before start checks, pretty straightforward. Firstly, we'll set the fuel selectors. So on the wing tanks to the engines, we want port tanks 1 and 2. For the port engine distribution, we want that set to 1 and 2. And similarly there on the right, we want the wing tank to engines set on 3 and 4, and the starboard engine distribution set to 3 and 4. So fuel selectors are set, the cowl flaps we can open. To do that we can either use the mouse scroll wheel or just pull those all the way up. So cowl flaps going fully open for the time being. The auto sync switch needs to go to dynamometer. Apparently otherwise we won't have any instruments, but that doesn't seem to be the case. On the aircraft you'll have instrument readings either way. And similarly with the mixture as well, it seems quite possible you can run the engines with the mixtures back idle. When the aircraft loads in as well, the fuel tank selectors will be off by default and the engines can still run. Anyway, speaking of the mixtures, they can go through to fully rich. A little bit ahead of time here, but again that's just to save us switching back and forth between the various stations. Looks as though the fuel pressure coming up. Anyway, that's pretty much all we need to do here for a fairly simplified start in the Boeing 314. So we can head for the captain's seat and we'll run through our checks there. So here we are then in the cockpit of the Boeing 314. We've obviously talked a little bit already about the graphical fidelity within the flight deck, so really here we're just going to run through the systems. Obviously we'll carry out the startup. Pretty straightforward for us again. Just briefly in terms of our positioning, we're currently facing out towards the west. We've got the rocket Gibraltar there off the left wing, just behind us. And we've got the Spanish mainland there off on the right of the aircraft. Anyway, in terms of our checks, the battery master is selected on. For the starting order, we're going to be starting the number 1 engine first. It will then be the number 4, the number 2, and the number 3. According to the checklist, we want to crack the throttles, but I'm going to keep those right back, as I find even with the throttles back at idle, we produce quite a bit of RPM on the live engine. That's going to pull the aircraft around. So throttles we'll leave closed for now. master mag switch is selected on, nav lights can come on there as well. Again, starting the number 1 first, so mags through to both. And just checking the left-hand side of the aircraft, looks like the prop area is clear. And all we need to do here to start the engine is hit the starter. So you can see disappointing start sounds there. The sound's just kicking in straight away, no coughing, no spluttering. And again, right back at idle thrust even, the aircraft getting pulled around here by the number 1. We're just going to come all the way back there on the props as well. You'll see we were idling up at around 1800 RPM, it looks like. Bringing the prop lever all the way back gives us around 1300, but ideally we want to be idling around 1000. Anyway, starting the number 4. And you'll notice as well, there really doesn't seem to be much nuance to the start. For example, we don't even have to use the booster here to get the engine fired up. Anyway, good start on number 4, starting number 2. And good start there on the number 2. And finally starting the number 3. And again, we do have a good start on the number 3. So the engineer checking the engine parameters for us at the moment, of course. And again, ideally we want to be idling just below 1000 RPM. Currently, even with the props all the way back, around 1200. And I'd be surprised as well there if we weren't getting 1200 with the props fully forward in reality, but I could be wrong on that one. Anyway, 4 good starts. We'll engage the gyro pilot master control, just down here on the left on the throttle quadrant. And for the takeoff, we'll leave the flaps up for the takeoff. Just going to come up on the throttles here on the right-hand engines, just to bring the aircraft back round to the right. Obviously the aircraft not particularly manoeuvrable here in the water. I think that's probably true to life. I'm not sure that the 314 has a water rudder, so we're just using the rudder surfaces here on the tail at the moment. We'll leave the flaps up for the takeoff. Apparently we should be fine to take off with the flaps up. We've got plenty of water here out towards the west. So just pulling the aircraft around, I've got full left rudder here currently, and again, a little bit of power on the right-hand engines. In preparation for the takeoff then, we'll start coming up on those props once again. Not going to carry out a run up here today. I think you can already see the engine modelling, nothing too sophisticated here. And obviously with us being in the water here as well, it's just going to pull the aircraft forward. So back up to full RPM there on the props, and the engine's idling around 1600 RPM, which again seems awfully high. Even the manual states to be around 1000. Anyway, in terms of the gyro pilot setup, we can uncage the directional gyro. I'm not an expert when it comes to the Sperry autopilot. I did read the manual here ahead of time. It seems to me as though there's quite a few features not currently modelled correctly on the Sperry. So firstly we want to set our desired heading. We're going to be tracking out to the south initially, and then heading westbound for the Portuguese coast. So we'll set west, we'll fly the aircraft manually out towards the south. Next, apparently we should set the top scale here using the rudder index selector. That does work correctly. So we'll select 270. We'll talk more about the gyro pilot once we're airborne, but again I've had quite a few issues with it so far. We should set the aileron index here as well. You can see that doesn't currently seem to function. No animation there. And similarly it looks like we can only select clockwise, not counterclockwise. And same goes for the elevator index. Again, only able to select clockwise, not counterclockwise. Anyway, as I say, we'll take a further look at the gyro pilot once we're airborne. Everything is set correctly and we are ready for the takeoff. Again, it's going to be a flaps up takeoff. I found that the aircraft actually at usual takeoff speeds really doesn't want to come out of the water. The tail will sort of bump up and down in the water, so the best technique I found is actually to hold the nose down until we get up to around 110 miles per hour, and then we can start releasing the back pressure and the aircraft will lift out of the water itself. So as you can see, a little bit of forward pressure here on the stick currently, just using ailerons to try and keep the aircraft straight. But this method I find does result in a much smoother takeoff, although I think the takeoff speed is rather unrealistically high. So just coming up through 110 miles an hour, easing back on the yoke. And you can see there the 314 lifting off pretty nicely. 500 foot rate of climb. The aircraft definitely climbs like a little bit of a rocket. We're already doing 140 miles per hour here and getting around 1,000 feet per minute rate of climb. We'll start a gentle bank out towards the south, again staying away from the Spanish coast. And once we're up through 500 feet, we'll come back to climb power here on the engines. So I think the takeoff roll feels slightly odd to me. I'm surprised that the tail bounces around down the back like that. Get up through 500 feet, come back to 35 inches on the manifold pressure, and around 2,500 RPM. One aspect of the aircraft I do actually rather like, I have to say, is the flight model. I think pilots have done a pretty good job with that. The aircraft certainly feels very heavy, very lumbering, very slow response on the controls, and a lot of inertia there as well. So just using a little bit of right rudder here to keep that ball centered up on the turn and slip indicator. And maintaining around 120 miles an hour now, about 500 feet per minute rate of climb. That seems a bit more reasonable. Again, with those engines back at 35 inches on the manifold pressure. So leaving Gibraltar just off the left wing. Sun's still coming up there out towards the east. Ideally as well, would want to start thinking about closing up those cowl flaps as we approach in towards the cruise, but obviously the flight engineer is going to take care of that for us today. So as I say, we'll just fly out to the south, keeping clear of the Spanish coastline here. And once we're out over the water, we'll track out towards the west, over towards Portugal. Off the nose, we've got Ceuta, just bang off our 12 o'clock position. We've got Tangiers off somewhere at our 1 o'clock. That's the African coastline out towards the south. The cockpit a little bit dark and gloomy here as well. We do have the instrument lighting selected on already. The rear stats are fully turned up there as well. As we turn back out towards the west, we should get a bit of illumination from the sun out behind us. So we've got 270 selected there on the gyro pilot. The directional gyro there seems to have had a bit of a moment, so we'll just cage that up once again. And uncage. We'll just wait until we got onto that westerly heading and then we'll briefly demonstrate the gyro pilot. As best I can tell, as I say, I think the functionality is not completely there yet. But it will hold the aircraft straight and level, so I suppose really all you need for these sorts of aircraft. And as I say, in terms of manual flying, actually really rather enjoying the Boeing 314. It's pretty much the aircraft's forte. I don't know how true to life the flight model is in terms of the numbers, but again, it does feel very big, very lumbering, and again, very heavy on the controls. You can see as well, very slow to respond. Just as a little bit of a demo, I'll go full left here on the aileron. You can see that roll rate, really quite lazy, which is exactly as I would expect the aircraft would be. So again, at least in my estimations, the flight model does get a bit of a tick. In terms of the sounds, very hit and miss there. The engine sounds are okay right now at climb power, and the same goes in the cruise. They do sound like some big beefy radial engines, at least to some degree. But there are a lot of sounds missing. For example, a lot of the cockpit controls have no associated sound with them, which is pretty disappointing. And it's not like some add-ons where there's just one or two cockpit sounds missing. Really, there are a whole plethora in the Pilot's Boeing 314, not currently included. And as we noted during the start, for example, the engine sounds pretty much going from nothing all the way through to the idle running sound. And similarly, when we cut the engines, although we might not see that in the video here today, but as you cut the engines, the shutdown sounds aren't actually synchronized with the prop animation, which again is a little bit of a disappointment. Anyway, we want to turn onto our westerly heading now, so we'll just get that set up. Heading for around 240 for now should do us in terms of keeping us clear of that Spanish coast. So there's 240, we have that selected there as well on the gyro pilot. I'm not sure whether or not in reality the directional gyro there is actually linked to the gyro pilot or not. It seems to be in the aircraft. So we'll just align the heading index here with our current heading around 255 there by the looks of things. And just coming up through 4,000 feet, those manifold pressures have dropped off quite a bit, so coming back up again on the throttles. We're certainly going to be climbing quite a bit higher later on, but for now we'll just get the aircraft leveled off. Again, just to demonstrate the gyro pilot functionality. So we just need to align the top index here on the directional gyro with our currently selected course. And we need to get the aircraft trimmed off, straight and level flight, hands free. Into the cruise for now, so we'll come back to 25 inches on the manifold pressure. And back to around 2,000 RPM. I'm not entirely sure how accurate that is in terms of cruise power setting, but it seems radials tend to like to run pretty slow. That seems reasonable. Okay, so we're pretty much trimmed out now, and again the aircraft, nice to hand fly, actually pretty easy to trim as well, and actually very stable once trimmed. I found I can fly pretty extended legs without even using the gyro pilot. So once again, just realigning that index. And again, we should be able to set the elevator index here. Doesn't seem to be possible. And similarly, can't select counterclockwise there currently. Anyway, we'll engage the gyro pilot. Just making sure we are level once again. And as you'll note, that does bring us on to our selected heading. Similarly, it's going to level the aircraft out there as well. A little bit unorthodox here, but we're actually going to head straight through to the conclusions of the review now. I think we've probably shown enough here to give you some sort of an idea as to the quality of the product. So as we make our way home up towards Southampton, we'll discuss a few things to finish up the review. So there you go guys, I do hope you enjoyed our demonstration here of the Pilot's Boeing 314 Clipper. As I say, whilst we cruise our way up the western coastline of Portugal here, we'll discuss a few things about the product, my thoughts so far on what the add-on has to offer. Again, not planning on flying the approach into Southampton here today, although we will just take a look at the landing at the end of the video. As I mentioned during the introduction, flying boats are not typically my thing, but I was actually quite excited when I saw that Pilots had released the Clipper. Again, it is a completely iconic aircraft and a very beautiful design as well. With its 4 big powerful radial engines, its multiple workstations, its vintage systems, I was really hoping for a detailed and complex Clipper experience. I'd even thought as well it might be nice to try some astral navigation at some point, as I believe there is an add-on that allows you to do that within the sim. In fairness to Pilots, as best as I can recall, the product description doesn't state that the aircraft is extremely high fidelity. But nevertheless, I was expecting more at this sort of price point, really in most regards. As usual, we'll run our way through the various aircraft categories, break things down into some negatives and some positives. We'll start with the negatives and work our way through to what I think is good about the 314. Starting with the negatives then, I think overall it's really just the general state of the aircraft. The product doesn't feel finished. does feel as though there's still quite a lot of work to be done really before it's bringing it up to the standards of a €30 add-on. Quite a number of systems on the aircraft either not working or modelled rather simplistically. We saw, I think, a pretty good example of that during the engine start. Radial engines do tend to be modelled fairly weakly in the sim. We've seen as well with the Caribou, for example, that the startup process is quite simplified. The Caribou, though, half the price of this sort of product, and it does excel in most other areas. So the aircraft system certainly still needs some work. I think another good example of that is the Sperry autopilot, which again, as best I can tell, still missing some functionality there. Once more, it would have been really nice to see a lot more nuance modelled into those Wright Cyclone engines. As it stands, the aircraft starts up flawlessly. Even with the systems in the wrong configuration, you can often still induce an engine start. Temperatures and pressures as well, really of no concern. You can hammer the engines all day, you won't see any sort of failure. Now that's fair enough if that's what the product's aiming for. Certainly it doesn't have to be a study level recreation of the Boeing 314, but for me that's really where a significant amount of the fun of flying these sorts of aircraft comes from. Engine management, really having to be very careful in particular with how you operate the aircraft. And given that, as I mentioned earlier, pilots do have a study level version of the aircraft available within P3D, I was hoping to see more of that systems knowledge, that technical depth invested here in the Microsoft Flight Simulator version of the aircraft. Sounds we've discussed already. As far as the engine sounds go, I think they're fairly decent once the engines are fired up. They sound okay both internally and externally. The startup sounds are pretty non-existent though. The shutdown sounds are better, but again they're not quite synced up with the prop animation. And again, as we've already covered, a whole host of cockpit sounds unfortunately missing currently. There's plenty of switches, for example, with no associated sound. Similarly, I believe the aircraft uses more traditional WAV files as opposed to a WY sound set. It certainly comes across that way, although it is actually quite hard to check, again with none of the doors or windows being operable. I think for me, texturing is also going to have to go down in the negative section of this review. Again, the external textures I don't think are bad. There are some nice textures as well used in the cockpit, but generally speaking the aircraft does look rather dated in terms of its texturing, and again I don't think the PBR materials hold up particularly well. Perhaps I am being a bit harsh there. I know that some people do enjoy the aesthetic of the cockpit, but it's not really to my tastes. And whilst I can forgive a more basic texturing and modelling set down the back of the aircraft, certainly at the front of the aircraft in this day and age in Microsoft Flight Simulator, again I really wanted to see an aircraft that just gave me every single detail, every single rivet of the Boeing 314. One last point that is worthy of mention, I had meant to cover it during the introduction. If you do want to purchase the aircraft, currently it's only available from the pilot's website. And if, like me, you purchase the product using a credit card, you'll actually need to wait for pilots to authorise the product sale. Not a big issue in of itself, but the manual authorisation actually only takes place once a day, so if you're a little bit unlucky on your timing, presumably you could end up waiting nearly 24 hours. That being said, for me it was around a 15 to 30 minute wait, so certainly not too bad overall, although it certainly did feel like a very dated process for purchasing a product in this day and age. Moving on to more neutral ground, I would say that the modelling of the aircraft is fairly decent overall. Externally, I think the modelling holds up pretty well. Internally, we've mentioned down the back is a bit more basic, but that's fine by me. And the cockpit modelling is pretty decent as well. Moving on then to my positives with the products. Firstly, the flight model. I think we've discussed that already, but the Boeing 314 certainly feels the part. It's very heavy on the controls, a lot of inertia. It certainly feels like a big old lumbering vintage aircraft. I think that pilots have done a really nice job there, and actually it's one of the more convincing vintage aircraft models available within the sim. The flight model did, however, feel quite a bit weaker to me on the water. I'm happy though to put the quirky water handling physics down as a Microsoft Flight Simulator issue. Obviously the sim does still have quite a few issues when it comes to water physics. And as I say, once you have the Clipper airborne, it is very decent to fly overall. Very pleasant as well in terms of cruise characteristics, very stable, easy enough to trim out for straight and level. The other positive that I do think is worth mentioning with the product, although I will caveat that slightly, in terms of the documentation included, very thorough, very detailed documentation. I really like as well that the manual comes with a historical breakdown on the aircraft. Lots of nice details there, vintage pictures, real world charts, real world performance data. It's a nice little piece of historical documentation to own. Similarly as well, you get a copy of the real-world Sperry autopilot manual. So pretty good detail in the manual overall. The only thing I would caveat there is that the manual seems to basically be straight over from P3D. A lot of the detail included in the manual actually alludes to the P3D version of the aircraft. And I think for me that currently sums up the issue really with the pilot's Boeing 314 overall. The modelling, detailing, textures and sounds of the aircraft tends to be more towards the P3D end of the spectrum. I don't think currently the aircraft is making the best of what Microsoft Flight Simulator has to offer. I think most of you that are familiar with the channel at this point will know that I take absolutely no pleasure in deriding someone's work. To bring an aircraft up to this sort of level I'm sure does take a lot of time and effort, and it's certainly far more than I could accomplish. But I do believe that most of us are expecting a high quality of work, particularly visually within Microsoft Flight Simulator. And whilst historically €30 may not have been a particularly expensive product, within Microsoft Flight Simulator it is starting to get up there. For example, you can buy yourself the PMDG 737-600, any of the Flying Iron lineup. Those and a number of other high quality products are retailing at broadly the same price point. So I came into this review feeling quite a lot of excitement for the Clipper, but unfortunately I'm going to be walking away feeling underwhelmed. Anyway guys, as always, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video then please consider giving it a like. If you want to see more content from the channel then please consider subscribing as well. As ever, a very big thank you to my channel members and patrons for all of your support, it is thoroughly appreciated. To all of you, I hope you are having a great day wherever you are, take really good care, and I will see you all again soon.